Okay, so welcome back to our second Roses session of the day. We've moved from the middle of the night in Japan to very early in the morning on the west coast of the US. We have Nola Agha from the University of San Francisco presenting on the labor economics of player development in professional baseball. As always, please keep your microphones on mute and feel free to ask questions in the chat room. Nola will talk for about 45 minutes, and then there'll be some time for Q&A at the end. So Nola, all yours.
Thanks, James, and thank you, of course, for organizing this really wonderful series. I love that we're able to connect people from all over the globe. So let's say that there's some benefit of COVID that we didn't think about in advance. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let me know if you're not able to see it, but this is the presentation screen, and I'm assuming that you can see my mouse as well.
We've got it, yeah, got them both.
All right, excellent. So again, my name is Nola Agha. Those of you that don't know me, I've been working on minor league baseball in various aspects for well over a decade. Today, what I want to talk about is the labor economics of minor league baseball. You'll also find that there's a strong kind of IO component to this presentation. And I will note here at the beginning, when I'm talking about player development, if we're talking about professional baseball, we call this minor league. There's obviously all sorts of player development systems around the world. They're structured differently. Certainly, Major League Baseball is very unique. It's not a club-based system. Some of the club-based programs around the world will look different than this, but just keep that in mind when I'm talking about development, that hopefully these things can apply to lots of different leagues around the world at some point. So today I want to talk about wage exploitation in baseball. I want to talk about why this matters to player development, give a little description of what the structure of minor league baseball looks like, discuss some of the labor conditions in minor league baseball, and then talk about some solutions. So this is very much a conceptual paper. It's not empirical. There are going to be some theoretical components, and I do have some numbers and some data, but this is the first step in moving towards something that's more empirical. Really, at the end of this, I've got three objectives. I really want to explain what a fascinating context this is, and hopefully convince you of that as well. Hopefully also convince you that it's a fairly understudied context, and that it's really an area that's ripe for a lot of theory development, but it's also some empirical work, and then really highlight this fact that there's no existing theory that actually fits the context that we're looking at, and we'll see if I can convince you of that throughout. So, in terms of the context of what we're looking at here, in terms of wage exploitation, I mentioned that it's a fascinating context. As economists, we don't always have the opportunity to move beyond these competitive markets, but sport is of course fantastic, right? We have a monopsony employer, we have entry drafts, and so players are assigned to a team. They have no opportunity to move because of the reserve clause for many years, depending on the sport. Major League Baseball, of course, has an antitrust exemption, and they have collective bargaining. They have a players union that they have to work with. So there is this long history that we have of actually identifying and measuring wage exploitation of professional baseball athletes under the reserve clause. But most of those findings find that there is some sort of wage exploitation. There's also this long history of looking at wage dispersion, finding in general that if you pay, any sort of pay inequality is going to lead to lower team quality. But what I'll note is that all of these studies are essentially done on the top 40 players in any professional team. So there are about 250 employees of a Major League Baseball team. 200 of those are development players, 40-ish are what we consider the major league teams or major league players. So really what we're talking about is a dynamic where we've done very little work on the employees within an organization. In fact, virtually none on the development players that are within that exact same system and firms. So again, this is just a small sprinkling of the work that we've seen, lots and lots of discussions over the years on Major League Baseball and this wage exploitation. Right, so why does this player development matter? Why should we focus on that? And I'm going to talk about it from two different perspectives, starting just with the IO perspective, and really starting with the firm, keeping it as simple as possible. If you're a firm, you need to have the highest quality inputs to production. So if we take it, this is a Fort and Quirk revenue function. The first equation is looking at revenues as a function of labor, and of course costs also as a function of your labor minus your fixed cost. In equation 2, we have we're setting marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, but those also a function of labor. So of course, these are your break-even constraints for win maximizers and profit maximizers. So regardless of what your firm intention is, labor is important, right? It's this critical input. You must have labor to produce, and you must have labor to either win or to profit maximize. So that means that teams, one of their major functions is to identify and purchase talent. And not only talent, but the highest paying talent in the world, because that's going to help maximize whatever your objective function is. Now, the identifying and the purchasing is happening at both the major league and the minor league level. So with your major league team, if somebody's injured, you're needing to replace them, but your development system is also in the process of finding and developing those best players. Now, when we start to think about how the system is organized, this works best if you own the rights to the players, this entire system. Okay, and it becomes more efficient to purchase. It becomes more efficient to develop if you own the rights to the players. And so that's the reserve wages, the reserve clauses that we see in these systems. The efficiencies come from cost reduction through these entry drafts and through the reserve, but they also come from this performance maximization. So if you're providing general training, but also specific training, in theory, you could be maximizing the performance, and again, therefore your objective functions. So the decisions that a team makes about paying its labor is going to depend on its win versus profit maximization model. But clearly, if you pay too little, it's not optimal because you're underdeveloping. And if you pay too much at the same time, your costs go up, and so it's also not optimal. So this idea of developing talent is really critical overall to the firm. And so from a labor economics perspective, why does player development matter? Well, as I pointed out earlier, there's 250-ish employees in a Major League Baseball team. They are employed by the team. There's a single employer. They are apprentices also on top of that. And any sort of training and apprenticeship model, we're looking at this exchange of lower wages in order for that training. So even though there's this expectation of lower pay, we know that pay can affect behavior. And it can affect behavior in all sorts of different ways. If you look at a similar employee in another organization, or even outside of your organization, and you feel like your wages are unfair and equitable, you can reduce your effort. At the same time, you can reduce your productivity. You can be less motivated. You can quit if you just feel like you're not being paid fairly, if there's too much injustice in the system. And so if you're trying to develop the best talent possible to win or profit maximizing, these are absolutely behaviors that you don't want. So there's this odd exchange between this apprenticeship model where there's this effort to reduce pay and logical effort, right? But at the same time, this need to have high enough pay that you're not having any of these negative behaviors. So it's really important, I think, to weigh these two different things. And so we'll get into that theoretically in a little bit. Before that, I want to delve deeply into the structure of baseball development systems, including the ownership, the assignment of property rights, outsourcing, and as well as contractual relationships, because this insanely unique system is going to affect player pay. Okay, so just some pictures for a little while to try and imagine what these things are. I begin with the observation that a single Major League Baseball club has this owns the rights to about 250 players ish. There are 30 Major League Baseball clubs. Of all these different players within the club, the top 40 or so are assigned to a Major League team that competes in leagues that are organized by Major League Baseball. Okay, so these players are assigned to the first division team, would be the equivalent, right, in a club-based sport. But to make this more precise, I can kind of like expand my bubble a little bit here to note that not only does the club own the rights to these players, but they also organize this contest. They are fully responsible for organizing any contest that this team takes part in. Okay, so they operate it. The club also assigns its development players to teams, but those teams are outside of the club. Okay. In other words, the club does not own or operate any of these development teams, a AAA being the highest level and all the way down to rookie being the lowest level. Okay. Now, this is slightly an oversimplification. There are one or two major league clubs that do own their development teams, but it's very rare. The primary model looks like this. Okay. Now, critical here, the major league club pays its players, but it outsources their competition to a separate firm that owns and operates that team. And now these teams, they compete in these leagues, and these leagues are organized collectively by an organization called Minor League Baseball. So Minor League Baseball is a league that simply just coordinates competition at all these different various levels of development. So in order to make all this coordination happen, what we see is that Major League Baseball as a whole, they have a contractual relationship with Minor League Baseball as a whole, and it defines the terms of this relationship. It's called the Professional Baseball Agreement. Okay, so if we simplify this for a minute, we take out some of this. If we look at the other contractual arrangement, it's this. This Major League Baseball club, in fact, every single Major League Baseball club has to sign what's called the player development contract with this outsourced firm, this other team that's putting on the competitions. This team, this minor league baseball team, they agree to provide a facility, locker rooms, concessions, ticketing, the mascot, a field, press box. They provide all the fan amenities and everything necessary to host a competition. So with so many different players of various levels, clubs also have to sign these player development contracts with every single firm that they're outsourcing with at every single level. Now, as I noted, minor league baseball teams, they don't own this main input to production. And this is also really, really critical. Okay, so this minor league team, they're a set of essentially, capital infrastructure, and they have no access to the players except through this contract. Okay, they don't own this main input to production. But what's fascinating is that they do receive the revenue from the event production. Okay, so it's a really unusual relationship, and it makes it really difficult to measure the degree to which minor league players are potentially exploited throughout their apprenticeship, because the revenue from the produced work does not flow to the employing firm. So Major League Baseball is paying these salaries of these minor league players, but the revenues are flowing to the minor league team. Okay, so the business of minor league baseball is not high profit. Just a little bit more about that for a second. It's mostly a break-even business. Owners, they make money basically on the sale of the team through any sort of capital appreciation. So it's a very risky business because they don't own the primary inputs to production. Because of that, Major League Baseball has had the upper hand in the negotiations over time, because if they withhold players, the teams have literally no ability to generate revenue. That they just have a set of infrastructure. And Major League Baseball has exerted this market power over the years through various PBAs, these professional baseball agreements. Before 1990, there was no ticket tax. Over time, you can see some numbers here, that the amount of ticket tax that minor league baseball has to pay to Major League Baseball has increased. It's already up to 8%. So, I simplified before, there are now some small revenues that are flowing back to Major League Baseball clubs, but it's not the full amount of the produced work. Okay? And I'll note later that none of these revenues are going back to minor league baseball players. So again, super unique structure, but what I want to do is shift just back to the labor side for a second, to kind of talk about this long history that we have of wage battles in Major League Baseball. It was only after 1966 that there was a Major League Baseball Players Association, that they were able to win arbitration and some free agency rights for Major League players. Major League Baseball has been guilty of colluding to reduce player pay. over years. So they don't have the best track record in terms of paying their employees well. But I'll note on the minor league baseball side, these players have absolutely no representation. There is no union. So even though they're employees of that same firm, they're really only representing the top 40 or so. On top of that, in the standard minor league baseball contract, in section 14, minor league baseballs also sign over their name, image, and likeness to any team in any medium whatsoever for any purpose. So there's absolutely no ability for them to learn or earn any money from licensing, video games, any other media. In Major League Baseball, the Players Association manages these rights, and they're a good source of income for players, and so that's completely absent on the minor league side. It's ironic to note that even college athletes might be able to earn money from their name, image, and likeness before minor league baseball players. So flipping back to our little picture for just a quick second here, this is kind of visualizing it. Here's these players that are recognized and organized by the Major League Baseball Players Association. They have the CBA, their collective bargaining agreement is called the Basic Agreement, and it's with Major League Baseball as a whole. So only a portion of the players on the team are represented. And of course, the organization that organizes the contests, and here at minor league baseball, they again have this contractual relationship as well, but what they're representing are the team owners, okay, not the players. So the consequence of this arrangement, the organization as well as the contractual relationships, is that salaries are really entirely at the whim of owners. So here's a chart, shows the 2010 as well as the 2017 season, some comparables for the Major League Baseball average as well as the minimum, as well as the pay for minor league baseball players. Okay. So unionized players here have seen a 10,000% increase since free agency. Non-unionized players, the development players, have seen a 70% increase in the same time period. Okay. If you look at these salaries for development players, a couple notes here. Players can receive signing bonuses. When they are drafted, there can be a single signing bonus when you enter into the development system. And that can range quite a lot, depending on who the player is and what round they're drafted in. But these are the salaries for an entire season. It's not monthly, it's not daily, these are seasonal salaries. Players only get paid during the season. So, this is the poverty level for individuals in 2017 was right around $12,000. This was, of course, for a full year. These, of course, are seasonal. But it gives you some context to the amount of pay and the amount of wages that these employees are earning. So in that, the pay also depends on the number of months in the season. The higher development leagues, they compete for 5 months of the year. So this is $11,000 for 5 months of competition. The lower leagues, they compete for 3 months. So you're earning just under $4,000 for 3 months of full-time employment. Okay. Now the working conditions are not ideal. Again, it's you're only paid for a short number of months. Clearly, you need another job in order to survive during that time period. And not only do you need another job to survive, but there are no resources that are provided to these development players for off-season training. So if I'm trying to be literally the best player on the entire planet so that I can compete on the highest and Major League Baseball team on literally in the globe, you would think that you would give something, for off-season training. Certainly, as an athlete, I couldn't train for 3 months or 5 months of the year and then suddenly come back and be able to pick that up again. So off-season training is an important part of this. Those are resources that are not provided to the players at all. Spring training, which is very popular in America, it kind of signals the start of the baseball season. Very long hours at 7 days a week. For an entire month. Players are not paid for spring training. They do receive a per diem and they do receive housing, but they are not paid for an entire month of labor. In the season, of course, like most athletes, it's long hours, it's long days. Often you're sleeping on a bus to get from one location to the next, but there is no pay for more than 40 hours of work. They're often quite poor conditions in terms of food and in terms of housing. There's reports of multiple teammates in really small spaces, sleeping on the floor. So there's not optimal sleeping and living situations and conditions. They have no power to change this. And so I think this quote from Jeremy Wolf, former minor league baseball player, is really powerful because it brings on this idea of fear of retaliation. And I really want to point this out because if we're talking about the system of employees, we have to distinguish it from competitive labor markets. There's a single employer here. There's a single chance to develop and to play at the highest level. And so players are reluctant to do anything that might potentially risk that. There's no possible way that they are going to speak up, unionize, complain. And that becomes a really critical part of the story as we move on. So because of these conditions, in 2014, there was a lawsuit that was filed. Now, because of Major League Baseball's antitrust exemption, which has been there since 1922, it shields the teams from any sort of lawsuits that are related to monopolistic business practices. But it doesn't protect Major League Baseball teams from federal wage or overtime laws. So that's why this 2014 lawsuit, it focused on the unpaid and the extra work that employers were doing. In response to this lawsuit, Major League Baseball essentially just spent a lot more money lobbying Congress. They were able to get a law passed, very deceivingly named the Save America's Pastime Act. What that did is it exempted baseball teams from having to pay minor league baseball players minimum wage, and it exempted them from paying overtime. So players don't have to be paid hourly. They can continue to be paid weekly salaries, regardless of how many hours they work. And they still don't have to be paid for spring training. So, I'll note here that if players were not experiencing any kind of wage exploitation, it's doubtful that any of these acts would have taken place, right? And remember that wage exploitation has been a common and reoccurring topic at the Major League Baseball level for Major League Baseball players for decades. So the context, the story here, it actually doesn't stop here. The events actually come more fast and furious in the last couple of years. So you've got players who are afraid to unionize. You've got a law preventing more pay. So the only path forward in this case was the creation of nonprofit organizations that were able to advocate for minor league baseball players. So More Than Baseball was founded the day that the Save America's Pastime Act was passed in 2018. They're offering free and discounted equipment and meals. So think about that. We've got athletes that are employed by the New York Yankees, the San Francisco Giants, the Major League Baseball teams, and their employees are receiving free or discounted equipment and meals by nonprofits. They're providing financial assistance for rent, host families. Again, Jeremy Wolf, he was, again, former minor league baseball player, but also the founder of this organization. Again, trying to reduce stress. And again, if you can reduce stress, you can probably develop better as a baseball player. Something fascinating happened in 2019 as we continue on this timeline. The Toronto Blue Jays earlier in 2019 announced that they would be increasing minor league baseball pay by anywhere around 50%, depending on the level and the classification that the players are at. So this is a natural experiment, right? It's the first time that there's any variation in minor league baseball pay. And so it's a really fascinating opportunity to potentially see if this can increase and improve their development. Just anecdotally, players reported they could sleep, they could eat, and they can train better. So again, how sad is that? A player being able to report that they can actually eat. Later in 2019, the lawsuit from 2014 said that it was given the approval to carry on despite the Save America's Pastime Act. So that was good news. And then in preparation for the professional baseball agreement that's going to be expiring in 2020, there had been huge hopes that conditions would improve for minor league baseball players in this negotiation. Again, there had been nonprofits, there had been movement, there had been a push to increase pay. Instead, Major League Baseball shocked everybody. They proposed revoking these player development contracts with 42 different minor league baseball teams, so almost 25%. So remember, those are team owners who really only generate revenue from capital appreciation from selling their team. And their teams, if they lose those player development contracts, are now essentially worthless because they have no ability to produce any sort of sporting contest. On top of that, that meant there would be about 1,000 fewer minor leaguers out of work because they had no teams in order to compete in. All right, so minor league baseball everyone was caught completely off guard by this proposal. Minor league baseball obviously opposed it. Again, remember they're representing the teams, but of course the consequence is that there was some support for the players at the same time. As happens every time Major League Baseball does something that that the world doesn't seem happy with, Congress threatens to remove their antitrust exemption. In this case, Bernie Sanders threatening letters. Whether anything will actually come from it, we don't know. Okay. Moving forward in the timeline, 2020, in February, Major League Baseball announced that they would increase minor league baseball pay. So it was the first time that they'd actually announced that there would be any shift in pay. Again, it varies depending on classification, but of course it is contingent upon their proposal to reduce the workforce, a 25% reduction. And then of course in 2020, right after that, the world kind of changed, right? Everything turns upside down. This is nothing that anyone could expect. All this is happening. And instead, the Major League Baseball season is shut down. The minor league baseball season is shut down. The league was trying to figure out what to do. Could they actually create any sort of contest? Could there be a season? In that time period where everyone was trying to decide what to do, Major League Baseball, they reduced their draft, so from 40 rounds down to 5. They only drafted 150 players this season instead of over 1,000. And they did agree to pay minor leaguers $400 a week. This is the rookie wage until they knew when or if a season was going to happen. Okay, so as I've explained, the financial situation of minor leaguers, it was tenuous before. It was worse with COVID. And so what happened was the creation of even more nonprofits. In this case, advocates for minor leaguers, they were demanding higher salaries. They were trying to unionize, and very specifically trying to unionize. Like, that's one of their main goals. Adopt a minor leaguer is exactly what it sounds like. You can literally adopt and sponsor a player. And really think about that for a minute. The Minor League Baseball Family Fund is another that was raising money. These nonprofits also turned into HR departments. You could see that Advocates for Minor Leaguers was explaining how to apply for unemployment. And these are essentially serving as social safety nets, providing money for players. When teams threatened to stop or reduce those $400 a week stipends, these organizations shamed them publicly on social media. And even Major League Baseball players offered to use a portion of their own salaries to pay minor leaguers when these billionaire owners wouldn't. So, obviously working conditions under COVID have deteriorated for employees across the country. And these COVID-related events are a small tangent, but overall, what I really want to highlight is the system. And that's what I'm interested in, is the system where, you're seeing nonprofits that are having to serve as social safety nets and HR departments and, doing all these things to try and support players, but also try and work with the teams. Because it's this system, or some form of it, that's going to come back after COVID-19. So that's why this system is important. And if we look at this system, none of this sounds like the behavior of business owners that recognize that talent is the primary input to production, right? These really look like short-term profit maximizers, and extremely short-term profit maximizers. Okay. So, hopefully I've convinced you that the organization of the system, as well as the labor conditions, lead to a situation of what I would call extreme wage exploitation. And maybe you'd say, okay, sure, it's on the surface, it all seems anecdotal. But remember, these are the same employers who have a track record of collusion and exploiting Major League Baseball players. But saying that, I will point out this one study, Krauman and Oppenheimer in 1996, in response to a lot of the research that was done on marginal revenue product of players in Major League Baseball, and there's underpayment. They said, listen, maybe it's not exploitation, maybe it's not underpayment, maybe that once you make it to the major leagues, those lower salaries, those are just returns to owners for training. Okay, so it's possible. So maybe this isn't wage exploitation, but we can certainly figure that out. In order to empirically test for it, we would need to have access to the true cost of player development, which we don't know. There's some financial statements that came out 10 or 15 years ago that give us some very rough estimates of what player development looks like. We don't actually know that. But we also need an environment where the revenues from player production accrue to the employer. And that doesn't normally happen in the minor league baseball context because you're outsourcing this. So I will note, though, the exception to this is spring training. There's really one fun exception. So this is just a news clipping. The Rangers, the Texas Rangers, brought in $1 million, says the headline, from spring training. Okay, and what we know from spring training is that wages are zero. So again, do we even need a study? Probably not in this context, right? So the consequences of wage exploitation are very real. You essentially have a very unhappy workforce. The employer's doing a very poor job of developing players if you have an unhappy workforce. So unhappy that they've decided to file a lawsuit against the system. So what I think the important questions here are, think about how many players are leaving the system, and not just players, but potentially star players, because that's the whole point of these development systems, is to develop the very best, highest playing talent to maximize your profits or your wins, right? What's the opportunity cost then of losing that superstar player? Maybe it's worth it. Maybe it's worth it to lose one potential superstar in terms of the cost of the system. Also thinking about what's the loss from underdeveloped players. So even if you have roster level players, are they underdeveloped because there hasn't been enough invested in their training? Okay, so that's when I think about these questions, then I start to think about efficiency. So if we're thinking about efficiency, is the system efficient? Are you losing players? Are you maximizing the development? So from a player perspective, what you really want to think about is how you can convince your employer that they will make more money or wins, depending on your objective function, by investing more in your training. Okay? And so the question from the firm perspective is, okay, if talent is this primary input to production, how can you optimize your wages and your training in order to maximize that talent, which is your input to production, okay? And therefore, of course, optimize your winning or your profits, okay? So if we're thinking about efficiency here, if we're thinking about the fairness of wages, I'm going to go through a couple different theories and then try and explain how they do and don't fit into this context. I'll start with the fair wage hypothesis. Okay? So in this, perceptions of the fairness or the equity of your wage are based on comparisons with others, okay? And those others, those even salient others in this case, can be inside or outside of the firm. And where they are is actually important because the model looks very different depending on whether you're comparing within or outside of your firm, okay? So what do we know about what minor league baseball players are doing and how they're comparing their salaries? Well, did that very non-economic thing, and I asked, used a survey. So I worked with these two different organizations, More Than Baseball and Advocates for Minor Leaguers, and when we did a quick survey. And it actually turns out that minor leaguers report that they are comparing their salaries to two different referent groups, one within and one outside of the firm. So when time comes, they're going to sit around in the clubhouse and they're going to, wow, how much did you earn working as a bartender last season or in the off season? That's amazing, right? So they're going to talk about that, and they're also going to talk about Major League Baseball salaries. And so they are comparing themselves to both of these different referent groups. In terms of whether they perceive their salaries to be fair or not, we asked, and we found out that 58% of them view their wages as unfair or very unfair. So we do have this problem. There is an issue within minor league baseball where these employees, development employees, essentially, are viewing their salaries as unfair. And 72% reported their needs were not being met in terms of wages. Okay, so we have this situation here. Now, this hypothesis predicts that when there is this perception of unfairness or inequity, it's going to lead to reduced effort. Okay, where effort here is very simple. It's a fraction of your actual wage and what you perceive the fair wage to be. Okay, so you have some sort of fractional effort. In other words, they're not maximizing their utility here. Do we have evidence then that minor league baseball players are reducing their effort? Okay, so remember, this is essentially shirking. And the answer is no, not really. Remember, there's a monopsony employer. They are so fearful of being kicked out of this system and losing their one shot at making it to the major leagues that they're not willing to speak up. They're not willing to unionize. They're not willing to do anything to risk that. So it's highly unlikely with a single employer and this one shot to make it to the big league that they are going to do anything, that they're going to reduce that effort. Okay, so voluntary shirking, are they? No, Probably not. But now involuntarily, I think that's a very different question. And this is one that I'd really like to dig into. And you'll notice that I'm going to mention it a few more times as we go through this. 36% reported that their needs were not being met in terms of food. About a third of your development players aren't eating enough. So really think about that. I mean, that's pretty shocking when you think about it. Another 58% said that their needs were not being met in terms of off-season training. So if you just think about it in terms of their involuntary effort, right? Are they not putting in full effort because they can't? Because they're not eating enough, they're not sleeping enough, because they're stressed too much, they're not getting enough access to training. That might be possible, right? So, if we were to break this effort into two different components, it might be there. Again, less than 20% reported that they would leave minor league baseball within the next year. So again, they're not purposely trying to reduce their effort. Okay, there's nothing here to suggest that they're voluntarily so unhappy that they'd like to leave the system. Okay, there are other predictions from the model. It says basically that you can see reduced morale. We actually saw that. 75% felt stressed or anxiety about their financial situation. Another 57% just felt stressed in general last season. Again, all pre-COVID. This is all information pre-COVID. That 64% were satisfied with their jobs. And now this is important. The model predicts that you're going to have dissatisfaction, but these employees are actually satisfied. And it probably goes back to the idea that you've got this monopsony employer. We also see the same effect with teachers and with nurses in the research on using the fair wage hypothesis and unfair wages. Teachers and nurses often report they're very unhappy with their wages. Their wages are very unfair and inequitable, but they often report they're satisfied with their job, right? So you're often doing your job for other reasons. Okay, which makes me start to think that maybe this hypothesis doesn't fit, right? We're not hitting the right conditions here. Again, is there going to be increased absenteeism? No. If you've got one shot to train and be promoted up through the ranks, you're not going to mess with that, not purposely, right? Again, is there increased labor market turnover? Maybe involuntarily, right? If you can't survive, if you can't get enough to eat, maybe you feel like you're forced out of the system. But most athletes want to stay in the system as long as they can. And this theory also assumes a perfectly competitive labor market, which we don't have. Okay. So moving on, I said that efficiency, some of these questions we thought about could potentially be related to efficiency. So there's the efficiency wage theory. This one, the core finding is that there are benefits to higher wages. And I always laugh when I look at this because I think to myself, well, that's the complete opposite of what Major League Baseball wants to do. In fact, they're generally trying to pay less, right? But the core finding here is, okay, if you pay more, there's benefits. It can reduce your shirking. But again, there probably isn't shirking in this system. This voluntary reduction of effort. No, it's very unlikely in the situation that we're talking about. Can it improve your performance if you pay more? Again, perhaps if there's this involuntary reduction of performance. Okay. Can it reduce turnover? We don't know. We don't know how many people are leaving because of poor and low pay. We're still trying to work on that. Paying more, does it increase your morale and your nutrition? Absolutely. And we know this from the natural experiment with the Blue Jays, the Toronto Blue Jays. When they increased their pay just a small bit for one season, we had employers reporting that they were happier, they could eat better, right? That they were feeling more excited about their job. So there is some evidence of that. Again, this still assumes this perfectly competitive labor market. And this, again, the whole point of this is that you should be paying more. And we have the situation where instead in these apprenticeship and these training models, in fact, you should be being paid less. And so there's the struggle here between the two. And we're not trying to increase effort necessarily. That doesn't seem to be the problem in the system. Okay. So if we look at training models, here in a competitive labor market, employers have no motivation to train. There's no return for their investment in training. Okay. Now, minor league players are receiving both general and specific training, and this very real cost in a non-competitive market does exist, and employers are willing to take that on because they have this motivation to train, right? Because they will be able to receive a return on some of that training, right? So looking at this model, this is the Acemoglu and Pish model. There's two time periods. In time 0, you're being trained, and in time 1 is when you're being paid and you're being productive. Okay, so if we take that, here we have wage as a function of training, output is also a function of the amount of training that you have. You'll notice that wages are below productivity in here because the rents are accruing to the employer in this situation, right? This non-competitive labor market. You'll notice that the wage function increases less steeply than the productivity. Okay, so the gap here, the delta, is greatest at higher skill levels. Okay? So if you consider that your revenues are equal to your productivity, your wages are equal to your cost, firms are willing to provide and pay for training by setting this marginal change in the non-training period profit, in the productive period, equal to the marginal cost of training. So this is your optimal level. You'll see it here. So there is some optimal amount of training that they're willing to provide. And of course, we see that. We see that in minor league baseball. Players are receiving training in excess of the pay that they're receiving. So it's a really nice high-level model. But what I would argue is that you're having to make some modifications for this. So the modifications in this case is that, first of all, you have to extend this time period. It's too simplistic to assume that there's training in time 0 and productivity in time equals 1. In fact, what we actually have is minor league baseballs have multiple years of training. And that training and the productivity and the wage are all occurring simultaneously. The other really important thing about this is that not all players become productive. In fact, most players don't make it to Major League Baseball. In a single season of all the players in the minor league system, only about 5% of them in that year are going to be called up to Major League Baseball. Okay, and so you have this situation where very, very few, the vast majority of your players who are being trained don't become productive. Okay, realize that you also employers are also losing out when employees underperform or they quit. And again, this is this involuntary performance reduction or this involuntary turnover that I was talking about before. Maybe they're forced to, right? Maybe they don't become productive because they were forced out of the system for some reason. What else? The other condition that's important here is that minor league baseball players, as soon as they're drafted, they are under reserve for that team that drafted them for a period of 7 years. So they can train for up to a period of 7 years. Once they are called up to the major leagues, their clock resets and they're then under reserve for an additional 6 years. So there is a long time period where the employer has this ability to recoup some of their training cost. So it doesn't have to be recouped just simply in year 1. But realize it's this bizarre system where in a more traditional model, you would expect that a highly trained worker, again, the highest, those that can make it to Major League Baseball, the competitively big market, you could quit, you could signal, your ability to their employers, but you can't do that, right? And so while the player's under reserve, there's this possibility that they can be paid less than their fully productive wage in order to recoup this cost of training. And again, that could be the Krautman and Oppenheimer 1996 prediction, is that that's why we're seeing these reductions. It's not, players aren't being paid less under reserve because it's reserved, they're being paid less under reserve because of training. And then finally, remember that these player contracts can be traded and sold. And so there is some residual value. Even if a player doesn't make it to Major League Baseball, there is some residual value that teams can extract from them. So these additional conditions, you can see, are quite extensive when you really think about it in terms of kind of just the simplistic model here. All right, so this current situation of underinvestment in minor league baseball suggests that Major League Baseball is not profit maximizing. And really what I like to make the point is that there is no existing theory that really allows for all the unique contextual environments or contextual factors that we see within the minor league baseball environment. Again, we've looked at Major League Baseball before, but when you look at the minor league baseball, their development system, there are these additional features that have to be built into any of the models that we're building. There are some potential empirical solutions. Again, this natural experiment with the Blue Jays, it takes more than 1 year to train a minor league baseball or a minor league baseball player to become a Major League Baseball player. We had only 1 year before the season was shut down. We'd like to track this over time. Anecdotally, again, we saw some claims that players were feeling much better, but we really haven't seen if that has made for a more productive development system. So that might take some time. If Major League Baseball stays committed to this announcement that they had, that they were going to increase their wages, if they stay committed to that in 2021, then again, potentially another natural experiment there. And then finally, I think probably the most promising way to look at this is team level expenditures on signing bonuses. So I mentioned that those wages were extremely low throughout their time in minor league baseball, but there's one opportunity to earn a signing bonus on the day that you're drafted. So we could look at the distribution of those bonuses and see if teams are being productive in terms of how they're assigning those bonuses, and see if there's something there that can help us relate, pay to performance and productivity in terms of development. So the professional baseball agreement is still being renegotiated. I have no idea what the pay and working conditions are going to look like in the future. So certainly while we're waiting, I'll be working more on developing and modeling these efficient development wages within these constraints. So I had 3 objectives today. I was hoping to convince you that it was an interesting context, that it's very understudied, and there's a huge opportunity here for lots of people to be involved, and there's really no perfect existing theory. So hopefully I've convinced you of some or maybe all of those 3 things. And with that, just looking forward to your comments, suggestions, questions. I'll put my email address here if you guys want to email and chat with me afterwards.
Okay, thank you, Nola. We've got a question. He asks, is it for minor league baseball to live only on in Spain, as well? Minor league players receive money, but most seconds where players get fully to soccer in Spain.
James, sorry, you broke up in the middle of that. Could you ask it again?
Yeah, sure. Is it expected for minor league players to live only on baseball in Spain, which I know well, Jorge, talking about soccer, minor league players receive money, but below second division, it's very rare for players to dedicate fully to soccer.
Yeah, so there, whether there's an expectation or not is, how do I answer this? I guess the answer is yes. The short answer would be yes. There's an expectation that they are going to have other employment. They are paid only for a season, and the reason they're not trained out of season or in the off season is that teams really restrict that. Say, listen, here's your season. You're trained within this. You do have to show up for spring training, which is an additional month, but outside of that, they're sort of hands off, right? You're really not being trained at all. There's nothing there. Now, again, the signing bonus is what is the interesting wrinkle in this. If you're drafted in the first round, your signing bonus could potentially be several $100,000, sometimes $1 million. So then are you expected to live off of that signing bonus over time? The best players, potentially the most highly productive players, the answer might be yes. Lower level players that didn't receive a signing bonus have nothing to live off of throughout their training period. So absolutely, it is necessary and expected for them to get a job.
Okay, thanks. And Carl says he doesn't know much about baseball, but how risky is baseball talent to the teams? The players often get the yips, and overnight stars can turn into duds, or is that rare? In other words, are contracts particularly risky for teams?
The risk is in the sense that very few players become productive. I mean, that seems to be the biggest risk in signing a player. Now, when you think about this development system, there's 2 ways to think about it. One is what I framed here as the player being the highest input to production, right? You want the best talent possible, and you're willing to invest in a system that gets you that. But in the minor league baseball context, or in baseball in general, the minor leagues, there are over 200 teams, and they spread through more communities in America than anything else. And so there's a big argument that, listen, minor league baseball isn't just about developing talent. It's also about developing fans and paying fans, people who want to be involved in purchasing and consuming the Major League Baseball content at some point in the future. And so, when you think about this risk, again, are we looking just at contracts? Are we thinking more about like the whole of the game, the bigger picture? And I think that's where the short and the long term really comes into play.
Okay, thanks. And then Dennis Coates says, very interesting informative presentation. Can you speak to the motivation to reduce the number of rounds in the draft and the number of minor league teams?
The motivation, it's hard to say. I mean, I guess I'm one of these people who would like to think the best of everyone. So where does this come from Major League Baseball standpoint? The pessimist would certainly say they're just trying to reduce costs, right? There's been this huge effort. There's lawsuits. They've had to lobby. They've had to spend money on lobbyists to pass laws. They're probably tired of people complaining that they're underpaid. And their justification can quite simply be, listen, if we cut 25% of the teams, sure, we'll pay you more. Right. And I think that would be the pessimist view of what exactly that they're doing. And that's exactly what happened. They threatened to cut those teams. It's not official yet. Again, that contract hasn't been signed. But, in response, they offered to increase wages finally. So it seems very clear on the surface that that's what they're trying to do. Again, probably thinking very short term and then losing this longer term picture of, are you removing baseball from America and therefore potentially reducing a fan base for a sport that, to be honest, is already losing fans and has a very aging fan base.
Okay, thanks. And then Dennis has got a follow-up. Can the clubs just sign undrafted players as free agents?
Say it again? Can
the clubs just sign undrafted players as free agents?
There is a very complicated system of signing players. There's actually an international draft as well. Can they sign? So a free agent, by definition, has to have served 7 years in the minor leagues, or they have to have served an additional 6 years in the major leagues. So those types of people are few and far between. Let's put it that way.
Okay. It sounds like there's a bit of a discussion starting to break out here. I'm always in this position when I'm chairing talks on baseball. I haven't got the faintest clue about baseball.
I understand.
Chipped in, but I'm conscious that Stefan's got his hand up. So, Stefan, if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question.
Yeah. Hi, Nola. Very interesting. I guess I got a couple of points. One which you just raised, which I think you need to integrate into the analysis, is how the international draft fits into this and how you think about that, because obviously they're a very different type of player. But I just really wanted to question the claim you made a few times there, which is that somehow this is not profit maximizing for Major League Baseball. This seems immensely profit maximizing for them. I mean, just look at the franchise valuations. I mean, these people make money hand over fist out of this monopoly. Now, you might say, well, maybe they could extract even more in, and that's possible. But I think to make that claim, you need some kind of evidence that would suggest that. I'm not sure I see any evidence that they're really there's ways they could squeeze even more rent out of this. But I'd be interested to hear if you think there are ways in which they could do that.
That's a point well taken. It really is. I guess, again, I go back to thinking about this in terms of efficiency. If the conditions in minor league baseball are as poor as players claim that they are in their lawsuits and elsewhere, then I guess the way I'm thinking about it is that there should be a lot of room for improvement. That in theory, you would think that players could be developed faster, more efficiently, perhaps generating even higher level talent. And again, if talent is what's driving your profit, but you're right, perhaps I'm thinking too much in terms of this not being profit maximizing. They certainly are generating profit, I agree. But I guess I'm trying to figure out at what cost, and could it be short-sighted? But I get your point. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Stefan. The discussion seems to be carrying on. I mean, Dennis and Frank, I don't know if either of you want to unmute yourselves.
Yeah, unfortunately, I can't see the chat. So those of you that are in the chat, I'd love to hear your comments.
Nola, Frank was explaining how they actually did the draft this year, because it was cut back to 5 rounds, which I wasn't aware of. And my original question was really what would happen in the event of reducing the draft. So if you only have 4 rounds, you have hundreds of potential players out there to sign. And so my follow-up question is then, Major League Baseball basically killed the independent minor leagues. And now, under this, it seems like the independent minor leagues would have a chance to come back and be profitable, maybe, because they could follow the old model of signing a minor league player and then selling that player's contract back to the major league. And all of the development costs get offloaded from Major League Baseball onto these minor league operators.
Mm. So actually, what I did is when I talked about this reduction in teams, it's an oversimplification, because what they actually proposed was a reduction in teams and a new, I even forget the name that they were using for it, but a new system that was essentially undrafted players that would be trained in a system that sounded exactly like independent baseball. But now that sort of those undrafted independent-ish players would be under the control of Major League Baseball. So it was a very bizarre proposal, super bizarre. But it sounds like what they're trying to do is actually take any potential players away from the independent leagues and have them be part of this quasi-independent league that would be then controlled by Major League Baseball.
They want to have it both ways.
Yeah, they really do.
I'm not sure if Stefan's hand up is still a hangover from the previous question, or whether he's got another question to ask. It's gone. So therefore, must have been a hangover.
Sorry, I was trying to. I forgot. I didn't realise I had to lower my hand. Apologies.
That's okay. It made me think, actually, it's kind of a minor point, really. I guess the discussion about the international draft and also the objectives of any kind of system like this, and it makes me think of the kinds of discussions that people often have here with our football and the development of young footballers here in England, say, relative to how things work in France or in Spain or Italy. One of the big things that's talked about here is we're concerned about how good our national team is. Are we producing enough good English players so that we can go and, we're never going to win the World Cup, let's be realistic, but, at least, do better at the World Cup, say. And then there isn't quite the same for baseball, right? I mean, there's not really you've got a World Series, but you haven't really got a World Cup of baseball, I guess, in the same kind of way.
There's the World Baseball Classic, which was essentially created to be that sort of competition, but it's not every year, and it requires so few players that it hasn't been an issue to find enough high quality players. But you're right. I mean, I will say that these some of these issues that I've discussed, I think they can apply just as well in other countries as well. Player development in other systems. There needs to be some optimal balance there between wages that are perceived as equitable and sufficient the compensation for training, that trade-off between receiving training as well. And so I think we just need to, I think that it's ripe for some really interesting research to find that efficiency point.
Frank says he thinks part of the goal is to have more players to go to college, like colleges underwrite training costs as they do in football and to some extent basketball.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any more questions? A couple more minutes.
Stefan again, could I raise another point? I mean, yep. I think you might also want, you don't really consider the hypothesis that maybe we've just got too many of these people. I mean, maybe we don't need so many baseball players. You can have oversupply as well as undersupply. I don't know how you test that, but I don't think you should rule that out as a possible explanation for what's going on here.
Absolutely, and that's the argument that Major League Baseball made, which is, listen, it does cost too much for development. If so few players are actually becoming productive, then I do have too many development players. But again, I think it goes back to, are you thinking incredibly short term? Are you thinking midterm? Are you thinking long term? Are you thinking that the development of this players it's useful for your own system. It's useful in terms of, again, spreading even just your brand around the country. So a lot of major league teams have started to bring their minor league teams nearby. And so the cities around you within 2, 3, 4 hours are now populated teams that are associated with your brand. So that does drive your own ticket sales and revenues and everything else. So it's a brand building exercise as well. And again, so it's building that fan base, and you're building that fan base kind of more broadly across the country. So, it depends how many levels we want to look at that, but absolutely, Major League Baseball made that argument, which is we just have too many players, and it's not an efficient system.
Okay, time for one last question. Jorge had his hand up.
Hi, I guess my question, I guess a comment. It's a follow-up from Stephens and in some sense of James. Maybe baseball is lacking, globalization. If you think football, when you talk about development, they are completely competing not only at the professional level, but also for youngsters. And so what you are seeing in baseball is maybe, too much supply of players where they really don't have where to go. And so you have this, restricted system that may affect how they get paid in the minor leagues and all this that we've been listening about in the last hour or so. If you think about football nowadays, in England, in Spain, all the academies, Barcelona, Manchester City, Bayern Munich, everywhere, but not only the big leagues, but even in medium leagues, Argentina or Mexico, for instance, they play pretty well, and they pay pretty well, and they fight a lot for youngsters. And so maybe it's just that baseball is lacking globalization. What James was talking about, you need maybe a World Cup of baseball to kind of push that sport to another level. I don't know. It's just an idea.
Sure. Yeah, actually, it would be fascinating to find out how many players are in youth academies and development systems in football, and then compare that to the proportion that we have developing players within baseball. It'd be really interesting to see that, even just to compare as percentages, globalized versus not. If the proportion is similar, there could be some interesting insights there.
Great. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Nola, in particular, for a really interesting talk. All that's really left to do is say that next week we carry on with our labour economics theme. Tim Pawlowski of the University of Tübingen speaking on individual labour market effects of local public expenditures on sports. So thank you, everyone, for being involved today. Thank you to Tamar and Nola for very interesting talks, and everybody for contribution to the discussion. And I wish you all a good weekend, however close that weekend is.
Great. Thanks, James. Thanks, everyone.
Right. Thanks, Nola.
Thanks.